The warehouse stood on the outskirts of town, surrounded by an expanse of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. It was the kind of place where the air felt heavier at night, where every sound seemed to echo too loudly. My job was simple: monitor the place after hours, ensure no one broke in, and report anything unusual. Easy money. But no one warned me of the silence, the kind that creeps into your bones and makes your own breathing sound unnatural. The first night was uneventful. I roamed the endless corridors, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The warehouse was vast, filled with towering shelves that stretched toward the ceiling, stocked with goods long forgotten. I tried to distract myself by listening to music, but the stillness seemed to seep through my headphones, forcing me to take them off. By the third night, the unease began to set in. It started small, shadows moving in the corner of my vision, faint rustling sounds when I knew no one else was there. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe a rat, but the feeling lingered, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, telling myself that paranoia came with the territory. One night, while patrolling the far end of the warehouse, I noticed something strange. A row of boxes had been overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. I hadn't seen it during my earlier rounds, and I was sure no one else had entered the building. I picked up the boxes and scanned the area, finding nothing out of place. As I turned to leave, I noticed something scribbled on the wall in faded red paint. It wasn't there before. The words were jagged, almost frantic. "Do not look." I felt a chill creep up my spine. My radio crackled to life, static breaking the silence, but no one spoke. I called out, thinking maybe the security office was checking in on me. No response. I told myself the signal was just acting up and continued my patrol, but my grip on the flashlight tightened. The following night was worse. The warehouse felt different, almost alive. As I made my rounds, I heard footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. They were slow and deliberate, matching my own movements. I stopped and listened, but the sound stopped too. My heart pounded as I shone my flashlight in every direction, the beam of light revealing only endless rows of shelves. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The warehouse answered with silence. I rushed back to the security office, locking the door behind me. The room felt safer, its flickering monitors providing a false sense of control. I scanned the security cameras, looking for anything out of place. At first, everything seemed normal, just static shots of empty corridors and storage areas. But then I saw it, on one of the monitors, a figure standing at the far end of a hallway. They were too far to make out any details, but they were there, unmoving. "Who's there?" I said aloud, even though I knew they couldn't hear me. I grabbed the radio and called for backup, but all I got was more static. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. I tried to convince myself it was a glitch or a trick of the light. But as I replayed the footage, I saw the figure again. This time, they were closer. I couldn't see a face, just a dark silhouette with limbs that seemed too long. I stopped the playback and stared at the live feed, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. I told my supervisor about the incident the next day, but he dismissed it. "Probably just some homeless guy trying to find shelter," he said. I wanted to argue, to tell him there was something wrong with this place, but I knew he wouldn't listen. On my last night there, everything escalated. I was patrolling the same area where I had seen the figure when I heard a loud crash behind me. Spinning around, I saw that a stack of crates had toppled over, spilling their contents across the floor. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice echoing. There was no response. Slowly, I approached the fallen crates, scanning the area with my light. That's when I saw it. A mannequin, half buried under the debris. Its head was twisted at an unnatural angle, and one of its arms was... I hadn't seen any mannequins in the warehouse before. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. As I turned to run, I heard footsteps behind me, fast, relentless. I didn't look back. I sprinted toward the security office, my flashlight swinging wildly. When I reached the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, my chest heaving. The monitors showed nothing at first, just the empty corridors. But then, one by one, the cameras started flickering. The figure appeared again, this time standing right outside the office door. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest as I stared at the screen. The figure tilted its head, as if listening. Then, it moved closer to the camera, revealing a pale, featureless face. The lights in the office went out. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. The sound of footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. There was a soft knock, followed by silence. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because I woke up in my car the next morning, parked in the lot. The warehouse was quiet, bathed in the early light of dawn. I didn't go back inside. I didn't even quit properly. I drove away and never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that knock. The hospital was always unsettling at night. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows in the empty halls. The faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air, and the hum of machines was the only sound in an otherwise still building. My job was to monitor the morgue during the night shift. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I had grown used to the quiet. That particular night started like any other. I clocked in, grabbed my clipboard, and settled into the small office adjacent to the morgue. The monitor screens displayed live feeds of the various cold storage rooms, their pristine metal surfaces reflecting the harsh light. Occasionally, I'd hear the creak of the old ventilation system or the faint murmur of voices from the floor above. But that night, something felt off. The power flickered briefly around midnight, plunging the building into momentary darkness. When the lights came back on, the monitors showed static for a few seconds before returning to normal. It wasn't unusual for the hospital's aging system to act up, but something about it made me uneasy. I shrugged it off, sipping my coffee and trying to focus on my paperwork. An hour later, the first anomaly occurred. The motion sensor for cold storage room C triggered, setting off a soft chime on my monitor. I frowned, staring at the screen. The room was supposed to be empty. I flipped through the logbook to confirm. There were no scheduled visits, no reason for anyone to be there. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down the sterile hallway. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally, each step amplifying the growing tension in my chest. When I reached the door to room C, I hesitated. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the air felt colder than usual. Pushing the door open, I shone my flashlight around the room. Rows of stainless steel drawers lined the walls, each containing a body. Everything seemed in order until my beam landed on the far corner. One of the drawers was ajar, the metallic surface smeared with condensation. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The small tag dangling from the drawer's handle read unknown. I pulled the drawer open further, revealing the body inside. It was a man in his late 40s, his face pale and expressionless. The toe tag listed his cause of death as a heart attack, but something was wrong. His head was turned slightly, his eyes half open. I stared, frozen in place. Bodies were supposed to be positioned straight, with their eyes closed. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper. It was soft, almost inaudible, like the sound of someone exhaling near my ear. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the shadows. No one was there. When I turned back to the body, its eyes were fully open, staring directly at me. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting erratic beams of light. I scrambled to pick it up, keeping my eyes on the body. It hadn't moved, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. I slammed the drawer shut and bolted out of the room, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Back in the office, I locked the door and stared at the monitors, willing myself to calm down. But as I watched, the camera feed for Room C began to flicker. Between bursts of static, I saw movement. The drawer I had just closed was sliding open again. This time, the body sat up. The camera went dark. I sat frozen in my chair, clutching the arm so tightly my knuckles turned white. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. They were slow, deliberate, and growing louder. My heart raced as the footsteps stopped just outside the office door. There was a long, excruciating pause. Then, a soft knock. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again, louder this time. I reached for the radio, but all I got was static. The handle of the door rattled, and the knocking turned into pounding. Desperate, I backed away toward the far corner of the room, clutching a letter opener I had grabbed from the desk. The pounding stopped. Silence filled the air, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Nothing was there. I waited, holding my breath, as the door swung wider, revealing the empty hallway. The light flickered overhead, casting distorted shadows on the walls. I approached the door cautiously, peeking out into the corridor. It stretched out in both directions, silent and empty. But the temperature had dropped noticeably, the air biting against my skin. I returned to the office, locking the door again. For the rest of the night, I kept my eyes glued to the monitors, but the feeds remained eerily quiet. When my shift ended, I left without saying a word to anyone. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I never went back to that hospital, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I swear I can still hear that knock. The gas station sat at the edge of a lonely stretch of highway, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to swallow the light. It was the kind of place where travelers stopped out of desperation, not convenience, a beacon for the lost and the weary. The graveyard shift was slow and uneventful, or so I thought when I first took the job. But that was before he started coming. It began on a Wednesday night. The clock had just struck midnight, and the air was thick with the suffocating quiet of the late hours. I was wiping down the counter, trying to keep myself awake, when I noticed him. He stood outside the glass doors, motionless, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I figured he was deciding whether to come in, so I waited, watching him out of the corner of my eye. Minutes passed, but he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the door. or maybe at me. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice muffled by the thick glass. He didn't respond. His presence unnerved me, but I told myself he was probably just another drifter or someone waiting for a ride. I turned back to the counter, pretending not to notice him anymore. When I glanced back a moment later, he was gone. I stepped outside to look around, but the parking lot was empty. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. Shaking off the unease, I went back inside and locked the door. The next night, he returned. This time, he was closer. He stood directly in front of the doors, his hood pulled low over his face. I could see the faint outline of his features, sharp cheekbones and a pale complexion, but his eyes remained hidden. The security camera monitor flickered, and for a moment, his image distorted into static. When the feed returned, he was in the same spot, staring. I picked up the phone to call the local sheriff, but the line was dead. "Hey, buddy, you can't just stand there all night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head slightly as if studying me, but still didn't move. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked into the woods. I locked the doors again, my hands trembling. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, but my mind kept replaying the image of his face, or what little I had seen of it. Over the next few nights, his visits became a routine. He'd appear without warning, standing in the same spot, always silent, always watching. The tension gnawed at me, the sense of being observed even when he wasn't there. One night, the power went out. The entire station plunged into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of the emergency lights. My flashlight's beam trembled as I scanned the room, every shadow a potential threat. And then I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. I could feel his gaze, even though I couldn't see his eyes. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate, and stopped just short of the door. For the first time, he spoke. "It's coming," he said in a low, raspy voice. His words sent a chill down my spine. "What's coming?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he raised a hand and pointed at the woods. Then, he vanished. One moment he was there, and the next, he wasn't. The darkness outside seemed to deepen, the trees blending into an impenetrable void. I locked the doors and stayed in the back room for the rest of the night, refusing to look at the cameras. When morning came, I told my manager about the man. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably just some local messing, but I knew better. There was something wrong with, something not human. I didn't see him for a week after that and thought maybe he was gone for good. But on my last shift before quitting, he returned. This time, he wasn't alone. The power went out again, plunging the station into silence. I fumbled for my flashlight and turned toward the doors. He was there, standing with a group of shadowy figures. They didn't move or speak. They just stood there, watching. The radio crackled to life, static filling the room. A faint voice whispered through the noise, but I couldn't make out the words. The figures outside stepped closer, their features obscured by the dark. I backed away, clutching my flashlight like it was a weapon. The radio went silent. The figures were at the door now, their faces pressed against the glass. I don't know what I saw. Human shapes, but twisted, unnatural. Their eyes were empty, like voids that absorbed the light. I don't remember much after that. When I came to, it was morning. The station was intact, the lights back on, but the glass doors bore long, deep scratches, like something had tried to claw its way in. I quit that day, and I've never gone back. But sometimes, when I'm driving late at night, I see shadows at the edge of the woods, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for something or someone. The diner was a relic of the past, sitting alone on a desolate stretch of road that cut through miles of empty farmland. Open 24 hours, it catered to truckers, night owls, and the occasional drifter. It wasn't exactly the kind of place where people stayed long, but for me, it was work. I had just started the night shift, a 6-hour stretch from midnight to 6 in the morning. The pay was decent, and it was usually quiet, which suited me fine. My first few nights were uneventful. The regulars came in for coffee or late-night pie, exchanging a few words before heading back out into the dark. There was something comforting about the routine of it, the steady hum of the fluorescent lights, the low chatter of the radio, and the rhythmic clinking of cups and plates. But on the fifth night, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. when the bell above the door chimed, announcing a customer. I looked up from the counter to see a man enter. He was tall and gaunt, his clothes slightly too large for his wiry frame. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh light, and his eyes, something about them made me uneasy. They were too bright, too sharp, as if they could see right through me. "Coffee, Black," he said, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, grabbing a mug and filling it. He sat at the counter, folding his long fingers together as he watched me. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. "You traveling through?" I asked, trying to break the tension. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as if considering the question. "Passing by," he said finally, his lips curling into a faint smile. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that made your stomach twist. He stayed longer than most customers, sipping his coffee slowly, his eyes never leaving me. When he finally left, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. But the relief was short-lived. As I went to clean his table, I noticed something. Scratched into the surface of the counter, just beneath where his hand had been, were 3 words. Don't stay late. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. I hadn't seen him with anything sharp, and the scratches were deep, as if they'd been made with a knife. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, maybe left by another customer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over me. The next night, he returned. This time, he didn't order coffee. He just sat at the counter, his piercing gaze fixed on me. The diner was empty except for the two of us, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. You should leave, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. What? I asked, startled. This place isn't safe. Not at night. I frowned, trying to keep my voice steady. What are you talking about? He leaned forward, his expression grave. You'll see. Before I could press him further, the lights flickered. For a moment, the diner was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, he was gone. The bell above the door hadn't chimed, and there was no sign of him outside. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of the job was getting to me, but the scratches on the counter were still there, a chilling reminder of his warning. 2 nights later, I was working alone again. The diner was deathly quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of the old building settling. At around 3 a.m., the power went out completely. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and the silence seemed to press in from all sides. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to navigate. As I made my way to the back room to check the breaker box, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the far end of the diner. My blood ran cold. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I slowly turned, shining my phone's light toward the source of it. At first, I saw nothing. But then, at the edge of the light's reach, something moved. A shadow too large to be human, its form twisting and unnatural. It crouched low, its limbs elongated and wrong, like a grotesque mockery of a person. The growl came again, deeper this time, reverberating through the empty diner. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. The shadow moved closer, its shape becoming more defined. Eyes glinted in the darkness, large, reflective, and inhuman. I ran, bolting into the back room and locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the breaker box, desperate to restore the power. The growling grew louder, closer, accompanied by the sound of something heavy scraping against the floor. When the lights finally came back on, the sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, before cautiously opening the door. The diner was empty, but the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. On the counter where the man had sat before were new scratches. This time, they formed a single word. R-U-N. I didn't finish my shift. I grabbed my things and left, driving as fast as I could down the empty highway. I never went back to that diner, but I still dream about it sometimes. The scratches on the counter, the growling in the dark, and those piercing eyes staring back at me. I'd always liked the quiet of libraries. There was something serene about the rows of bookshelves stretching into the dimly lit space, the faint smell of aged paper and leather, and the soft hum of the air conditioner. When I got the night shift as a security guard at the old city library, I thought it would be an easy job. Just me, a few cameras, and the silence. The library was massive, built in the late 1800s. It had high ceilings, marble floors, and towering shelves filled with ancient tomes. People said it was haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to those stories. Ghosts weren't something I believed in, and besides, it was just a job. All I had to do was patrol the building every hour, check the cameras, and make sure no one broke in. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of my time in the security office, sipping coffee and watching the monitors. Occasionally, I'd hear the distant creak of a floorboard, or the shuffle of something moving, but I always chalked it up to the building settling or a stray breeze sneaking through the old windows. But on the 5th night, things started to change. It was a little after 2 a.m., and I was making my rounds. The main reading hall was my favorite part of the library, a grand room with arched windows, long oak tables, and massive chandeliers that hung from the ceiling. As I walked through, my flashlight caught something out of place. One of the chairs at the far end of the room was pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there. I frowned. I was sure it hadn't been like that earlier. I walked over, looking around for any sign of an intruder. The air was colder here, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. On the table was an open book. Its pages were blank, but the faint impression of writing could be seen, as though someone had scribbled furiously and then erased it. I ran my hand over the paper, feeling the grooves, but there was no ink, no visible writing. My unease grew. I closed the book and returned the chair to its place, trying to shake off the strange feeling. Back in the security office, I checked the cameras. The reading hall was empty. I rewound the footage, watching to see if someone had been there earlier, but the camera glitched during the time I had been in the hall. Static filled the screen for several minutes before it returned to normal. My heart began to race. At 3 a.m., I heard the first noise. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping. It came from the second floor, where the archives were. Those rooms were off limits to the public and always locked. I grabbed my flashlight and headed up the grand staircase. The tapping grew louder as I approached the archive room, rhythmic and deliberate. When I reached the door, I stopped. The tapping was coming from inside. I tested the handle. It was locked, just as it should be. Leaning closer, I tried to peer through the small glass window in the door, but the room was pitch black. "Hello," I called, my voice echoing down the empty hall. The tapping stopped. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the handle, before I decided to check the key. The keys for the archives were in a drawer back in the office, and I needed to confirm nothing had been tampered with. As I turned to leave, I heard it, a faint whisper, low and indistinct, coming from the other side of the door. I didn't wait. I went back to the office and checked the keys. They were all accounted for. Still, my nerves were shot, and I decided to keep a close eye on the monitors for the rest of the night. At 4 a.m., the power went out. The security monitors flickered off, plunging the office into darkness. My flashlight was the only source of light, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. I grabbed my radio, but all I got was static. The silence was suffocating. I stepped out into the main hallway, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The library felt different, heavier, like the air was pressing down on me. As I made my way toward the staircase, I noticed something on the marble floor. Footprints, wet, muddy footprints, leading from the main entrance and disappearing into the shadows. They weren't there before, and the front doors were locked. I followed the trail cautiously, my heart pounding. The footprints led to the reading hall. As I entered, my flashlight caught movement, a figure standing at the far end of the room. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its back turned to me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Slowly, it turned its head, and I saw its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only darkness, an empty void where eyes and features should have been. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and in that instant, I heard it again, the whispering. It was all around me now, growing louder. Words I couldn't understand. I fumbled for my flashlight, my hand shaking, and when I finally managed to turn it back on, the figure was gone. I didn't wait for my shift to end. I grabbed my things and left the library, driving home as fast as I could. I called in sick the next day and never went back. A week later, I heard on the news that the library was closing temporarily due to structural issues, but the reporter mentioned something else, a missing security guard. They didn't give his name, but I knew it was the guy who'd worked the shift before me. I still can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that library is still there, waiting in the dark, whispering its secrets to anyone foolish enough to listen. The hospital stood on the outskirts of town, a hulking relic of another era. Its brick facade was weathered and cracked, its windows reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. St. Augustine's General was perpetually understaffed, and its night shifts were notorious for being grueling, but the pay was good, and I needed the money. So I took the job as a night orderly without hesitation. The first few weeks were typical. Long hours, endless paperwork, and the occasional emergency. The hospital at night was a quiet, eerie place. The fluorescent lights flickered. The halls were often empty, and the faint hum of medical machines filled the air. The worst part wasn't the work itself, but the unsettling sense of being watched. It was the third week when I first noticed something odd. I was making my rounds on the fourth floor, where the long-term care patients stayed. Most of them were elderly, their rooms dimly lit, their breathing the only sound in the otherwise silent wing. As I passed room 409, I glanced in out of habit. The bed was empty, the sheets perfectly made, but the chair by the window was turned toward the wall. That struck me as strange. I distinctly remembered it being against the window earlier in the night. I stepped in and moved the chair back to its place. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint creak behind me. My stomach clenched. When I turned around, the chair was back against the wall. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing for a rational explanation. Maybe I'd imagined moving it. Maybe the wheels on the chair had shifted on the uneven floor. I moved it back, this time carefully. I even took a photo on my phone to remind myself where I'd left it. Then, I left the room, determined to forget about it. But the sense of unease lingered. The following night, things escalated. At around 2 a.m., I was restocking supplies in the nurse's station when I heard the faint sound of laughter. It was soft, almost playful, and coming from the direction of the fourth floor. I stepped into the hallway, listening intently. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps, light, almost childlike, echoing down the corridor. No one was supposed to be up here except the staff and patients. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound. It led me back to room 409. The door was ajar, the room dark. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The chair was back against the wall. My heart raced as I stepped inside, the flashlight casting long, jittery shadows. On the floor by the chair was a single, small handprint. It looked like it had been made in dust, the edges smudged, as if someone had pressed their hand against the cold tile. I crouched down to inspect it, and that's when I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. The air felt thick, oppressive, and the faint scent of roses hung in the air, out of place in the sterile hospital. I backed out of the room, shutting the door firmly behind me. When I returned to the nurse's station, I found one of the senior nurses, Karen. She was in her late 50s and had worked at St. Augustine's for decades. I told her what had happened, expecting her to laugh it off. But instead, her face grew pale. Room 409, she said softly, her voice tinged with fear. We don't talk about that room. I pressed her for details, but she shook her head. Just stay away from it. It's better that way. But I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what was happening. The next night, during my break, I searched the hospital's archives. It took hours of digging, but I finally found an old incident report from 20 years ago. A child, a little girl named Emily, had died in that room. She had been brought in after a car accident, and though the staff had done everything they could, she hadn't made it. Her parents never came to claim her body, and rumor had it that her spirit never left. That night, I avoided the fourth floor as much as possible, but just before my shift ended, I heard it again. The laughter, soft and echoing. It wasn't coming from 409 this time. It was everywhere, surrounding me, growing louder and louder, until it was deafening. I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air in the cool night. When I finally mustered the courage to go back inside, it was nearly dawn. I went straight to the manager and handed in my resignation. I haven't set foot in St. Augustine since, but I can't forget that laughter or the way the air felt in that room. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with the scent of roses lingering in the air and the faint sound of laughter echoing in my ears. It was supposed to be an easy gig, 3 nights a week working as a cashier at a 24-hour gas station just off the highway. The pay wasn't great, but the shifts were quiet, and I didn't have to deal with many people. For the most part, it was just truckers fueling up or the occasional lost traveler looking for directions. The first few shifts were uneventful, exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd bring a book, sit behind the counter, and occasionally glance up at the small TV mounted in the corner. The store was surrounded by dense woods, and the only light came from the buzzing fluorescent bulbs above the gas pumps. Beyond that, the darkness swallowed everything. It was my fourth shift when things started getting strange. It was close to midnight, and I was leaning on the counter, flipping through a magazine. A loud ping echoed outside, like metal striking. I glanced at the monitors, 5 grainy black and white feeds showing the parking lot and pump area. One of the cameras, the one pointed toward the back of the station, was out. Static filled the screen. I sighed, assuming it was just another technical glitch. But then, movement caught my eye. On one of the working cameras, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the light, just beyond the furthest pump. It was hard to make out any detail, but they seemed off. Their posture was stiff, and they were just standing there, staring toward the store. I grabbed the intercom mic. Hey, you need help? My voice crackled through the outside speakers. The figure didn't move. I put the mic down and kept watching. Something about the stillness made my skin crawl. Most people would wave, approach, or at least react. This person just stood there, motionless, like a mannequin left in the wrong place. After a few minutes, I decided to step outside. The night air was cold and the silence was deafening. Hello, I called, my breath visible in the dim light, but the figure was gone. I looked around, shining my phone's flashlight toward the woods, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound of someone running away, just the faint hum of insects and the distant rustle of leaves. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was quiet, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next night, it happened again. Around the same time, I heard the ping outside, followed by the flicker of one of the security monitors. This time, it wasn't static. The screen showed the back of the station, and something was moving. A shadow flitted just out of view, quick and erratic. I froze, staring at the screen. It was almost hypnotic, the way the shadow seemed to dart and weave, always staying just out of focus. Then, for a brief second, the shadow paused at the edge of the camera's view. 2 glowing eyes stared directly at the lens. My stomach dropped. Those weren't normal eyes. They weren't reflecting light. They were the light, bright, unblinking, and unnervingly intelligent. I grabbed the mic again. Whoever's out there, you need to leave. Now. No response. The cameras returned to normal, and the glowing eyes disappeared. I didn't sleep well that day. By the third night, I was already on edge. I told myself I'd quit after this shift, but I needed the money, and quitting midweek would leave me scrambling for something else. The night started quietly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At around 3 a.m., the lights above the pumps flickered. I glanced at the monitors. All of them were filled with static now. The power inside the store remained on, but the cameras were useless. That's when I heard it. A soft, scraping sound coming from the back of the store, near the supply room. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from under the counter and cautiously made my way toward the sound. The scraping grew louder as I approached the door. My pulse pounded in my ears. When I opened the supply room door, it was empty, but scratched into the metal shelves were three deep gouges like claw marks. They weren't random. They formed a single word: run. A chill ran down my spine. I backed out of the room, shutting the door firmly. My hands were trembling as I returned to the counter. That's when the front doorbell chimed. I froze. No one should have been able to get in. I'd locked the doors after the first night's incident. Slowly, I turned toward the entrance. The door was wide open, swinging gently as if someone had just stepped inside. But the store was empty. The lights above the counter flickered, casting strange shadows across the wall. The air felt heavy, oppressive. And then I saw it. Something moving in the reflection of the cooler doors. A shape, tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and its face obscured by darkness. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and bolted out the back exit, not stopping until I reached my car. When I looked back, the gas station was completely dark. No lights, no hum of the fluorescents, just an empty shell swallowed by the night. I never went back to that job. A few weeks later, I heard the station had shut down permanently. The owner claimed it was due to structural issues, but I knew better. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving past dark stretches of highway, I think about that figure in the woods, about the glowing eyes and the scratches on the shelves, and I can't help but wonder if whatever was out there that is still waiting, hidden in the shadows, watching for someone new. It was my first night working as a janitor at Pinecrest Office Park, a sprawling five-story building in the middle of nowhere. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well, and I didn't mind the solitude. The building was mostly empty at night, save for a handful of employees who stayed late. My task was simple: clean each floor, take out the trash, and lock up before dawn. The night started like any other. I arrived at 10 p.m., grabbed my cleaning supplies, and began on the first floor. The halls were eerily quiet, a kind of silence that seemed to amplify every creak and shuffle. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the polished floors. By midnight, I had finished the first two floors without incident. It was on the third floor that things started to feel off. The third floor was mostly empty offices and conference rooms, with a large open area filled with cubicles. As I stepped out of the elevator, I felt it immediately, a weight in the air, like I was being watched. I tried to shake it off and got to work, wiping down desks and emptying trash bins. Halfway through the floor, I noticed something strange. One of the cubicles had a desk lamp on, its light casting an eerie glow. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes employees forgot to turn off their lights. But as I approached, I saw something that made me stop cold. The lamp wasn't plugged in. The cord dangled loosely from the desk, yet the bulb shone brightly. My skin prickled as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then, just as suddenly as it had caught my attention, the light flickered and went out. The cubicle was plunged into darkness. I backed away, my heart racing. I decided to finish the rest of the floor quickly and move on. But as I turned toward the cleaning cart, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. In the reflection of a glass window, a figure darted past. It was quick, just a shadow, but it was enough to send my pulse into overdrive. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the cubicle maze. Nothing. The space was empty. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I finished the third floor in record time and moved to the fourth. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and jumpy because of the late hour. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with this. The fourth floor was even worse. As I stepped out of the elevator, the lights above me flickered violently before going out completely. I stood there in the dark, clutching my flashlight, my breath echoing in the silence. The emergency lights kicked on a moment later, casting the hallways in a dim, reddish glow. I started cleaning, but my nerves were shot. Every creak of the floor, every distant hum of the air conditioner made me jump. As I emptied a trash bin near the break room, I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping inside. I hesitated. The break room door was slightly ajar, and the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I pushed the door open slowly, shining my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just a table, a few chairs, and a microwave on the counter. But the tapping didn't stop. It was coming from the window at the far end of the room. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The window overlooked the empty parking lot, the asphalt glistening faintly under the streetlights. But the tapping wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the inside of the glass. The moment I realized that, the tapping stopped. A handprint appeared on the window, small and smudged, as if someone had pressed their palm against the glass. But I was alone in the room. I backed out quickly, slamming the door behind me. By the time I reached the fifth floor, I was ready to call it quits. The top floor was mostly storage and a few executive offices, rarely used during the day, and completely deserted at night. The long hallway leading to the storage area felt like it stretched on forever, the red emergency lights making the shadows seem alive. I was halfway down the hall when I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, echoing in the silence. I froze, gripping my flashlight tightly. The footsteps grew louder, coming from behind me. I turned, shining the beam of light down the hall. No one was there. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps stopped, but the sound was replaced by something worse, a soft whispering. It was faint, almost inaudible, like a dozen voices murmuring at once. I couldn't make out the words, but they seemed to be coming from all around me. Panic set in. I sprinted down the hall toward the storage room, desperate to finish and get out of the building. I flung the door open and froze. Inside, the shelves were lined with old file boxes and equipment, but in the center of the room stood a chair, and sitting in the chair was a figure. Their head tilted at an unnatural angle. They were completely still. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move. Slowly, I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I circled around, the figure's face came into view, and I immediately wished it hadn't. The eyes were hollow sockets, and the mouth was stretched into a grotesque grin, the skin pale and waxy like a mannequin. Before I could react, the figure jerked its head toward me, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispers erupted into a deafening cacophony. I bolted out of the room, down the hall, and into the elevator, slamming the button for the ground floor. The whispers followed me, growing louder, until the elevator doors finally closed. I quit the next morning. I don't know what I saw in that building, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I drive past Pinecrest Office Park at night, I see lights flicker in the windows and feel the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. I had been working at the old library for just a few months when I first heard the rumors. The building itself was a marvel, huge, with high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and old stone floors that creaked as you walked. But it wasn't just the architecture that intrigued me. It was the unsettling atmosphere that seemed to pervade every corner of the building. There was something about the library that made it feel haunted. It wasn't the stories of the ghosts that scared me, it was the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of a library, the kind of silence you could break with a whispered word. No, this silence was unnatural, oppressive, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The long rows of bookshelves seemed to stretch on forever, and the thick air made everything feel like it was stuck in time, like the building hadn't changed in decades, maybe even centuries. I had started my shift in the late afternoon, the usual routine, shelving books, checking in returned ones, and making sure the library was clean and organized. The evening shift was always the worst, though. The lights flickered sometimes, casting strange shadows, and the air grew colder the later it got. I always worked alone during these shifts, and I'd gotten used to it, or at least I thought I had. Around 11 p.m., I noticed something strange in the back corner of the library. It was a small reading nook, tucked away between two large bookshelves. I'd seen it hundreds of times, but that night, something was different. A book lay open on one of the chairs, its pages yellowed and torn. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I noticed something odd. The book was positioned as if someone had just been reading it, and the words on the page seemed off. I bent closer to inspect it. The text was strange, letters that didn't belong in any language I recognized, twisted and curling into shapes that made my head spin. The book seemed to be alive, almost pulsing with a rhythm of its own. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the pages, and immediately felt a cold rush of air. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was soft at first, like the rustling of a leaf, but then it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't in any language I understood, but it felt like it was coming from the very walls themselves. I jerked my hand back, my heart pounding. I glanced around the nook, but the library was still and empty, the dim light casting long shadows across the rows of books. I didn't know why, but I closed the book and put it back on the shelf. The moment my fingers touched the spine, the whispering stopped. It was like the sound had been sucked out of the air. I stood frozen for a moment, waiting, but everything seemed normal again. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the stress of working late, but the feeling in the library had changed. It was heavier now, thicker, like the very air was pressing in on me. I made my way back to the main desk, hoping the normalcy of checking in some books would distract me. Around 2 a.m., I was sitting at the front desk, staring blankly at the computer screen when I heard it again. A soft creaking, faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from the back of the library. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty halls. I stood up quickly, my pulse racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely breaking the silence. No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the back. The creaking continued, growing louder with each step I took. But when I reached the section near the reading nook, there was nothing. Just the empty aisles of books and the occasional shift of the ceiling settling. I was about to turn back when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I spun around, my flashlight beam catching something at the edge of the aisle. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, a shadow, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned fully, the aisle was empty. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The silence in the library felt different now, more oppressive, like the space itself was holding its breath. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the ground near the nook, a trail of dark smudges, like something had been dragged across the floor. My breath caught in my throat. The trail led to the very spot where I had found the book earlier, the place where I had felt the cold rush of air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly followed the trail, the sound of my footsteps unnervingly loud in the silence. The trail stopped abruptly in front of the same bookshelf where I had put the book back. I stared at the shelf, my flashlight trembling in my hand. For a moment, everything was still. And then, just as I was about to turn around and run, the whispering started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud and clear, and it seemed to come from everywhere. "Look behind you." I whipped around, but there was nothing, just the shelves of old, dusty books, the same as before. But as I turned back to face the shelf where the book had been, my eyes fell on something that made my stomach drop. The book was back in the chair. I didn't remember putting it. It was open, pages flapping as though someone had been reading it just moments before. I backed away, my mind racing. The whispering grew louder, the words unintelligible but somehow urgent. I turned and fled, running out the back door and into the cold night air. I never looked back. The next day, I went to the library's management to ask about the book, but they acted as if they didn't know what I was talking about. They said there were no books missing or out of place, but I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I haven't returned to that library since. Every time I pass it on my way to work, I can't help but glance up at the windows, expecting to see something watching me from inside. The book, and whatever it contained, is still there, waiting for someone else to find it. And I'm sure, when they do, it will start again. I had always worked the night shift at the same convenience store in a sleepy town on the outskirts of nowhere. The pay was decent, and the hours weren't bad. Sure, the store wasn't much to look at. Flickering lights, worn linoleum floors, shelves stacked with snacks and soft drinks. But it was quiet, and most nights passed without incident. Most nights. One night, around 2 a.m., I was sitting behind the counter, chewing gum and scrolling through my phone, when the bell above the door jingled. It wasn't unusual. There were always a few late-night customers looking for cigarettes, energy drinks, or snacks. I didn't even look up at first. Then, I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, followed by a faint scraping noise. I glanced up, and my stomach tightened. A figure was standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man. His clothes were tattered and torn, his face hidden by a dirty, dark hood. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket, and his feet dragged across the floor like he could barely lift them. His eyes were wide open, staring at me without blinking. "Can I help you?" I called out, trying to mask the unease in my voice. The man didn't answer. Instead, he shambled slowly into the store, his steps unsteady and heavy. The sound of his shoes scraping against the floor was unnerving. I stood up from my stool and took a cautious step forward, trying to gauge whether he was drunk, sick, or maybe just a little off. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked, my voice growing more hesitant. Still no answer. As he passed the aisles, I saw that his eyes weren't just wide. They were completely black, as if there was no white part left, just inky voids that seemed to absorb all the light around them. My breath caught in my throat, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Do you need help?" I said again, this time more firmly. "We're about to close, so if you're just browsing—" He didn't let me finish. With a sudden jolt, he turned his head toward me, his neck snapping unnaturally. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His pupils weren't just black. They were empty, like the vast void of space. I took a step back. "Sir, I'm calling the police," I said, my voice trembling. But the man didn't move. He just stared at me. And then, in the stillness of the store, I heard something, a soft whisper. So faint I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination. But it was there, clear as day. "Run." I froze, my heart racing. Then, the man took a step forward. His movements were jerky and erratic, like he was forcing himself to walk, each step coming with a horrible dragging sound. He didn't speak, didn't need to. The air around him grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast it felt like winter had suddenly arrived. Instinct kicked in. I turned and bolted for the back door, slamming it shut behind me. I ran into the alley behind the store and looked back. The lights inside flickered, casting eerie shadows through the windows. But there was no sign of the man. Nothing. I stood there, panting, my breath visible in the cold air, waiting for him to appear. But after a few minutes, I convinced myself it was over. Maybe it was just some crazy guy who wandered in, maybe a prank, something that would make sense in the morning. I calmed myself down, told myself it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But then I heard it. The scraping sound, the same dragging noise. I turned slowly, and there, standing at the entrance of the alley, was the man, his head tilted unnaturally to the side, his black eyes locked on me. He didn't move a muscle. He just stood there, staring. And then he smiled. But it wasn't a normal smile. His mouth stretched too wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to go on forever. The corners of his mouth cracked, and his teeth glistened in the dim streetlight. "Run," he whispered again, his voice a guttural rasp that sent a chill straight down my spine. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran down the alley, my feet pounding against the cold concrete. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street, where I could see the lights of the police station. I stumbled inside, gasping for breath, my heart still racing. I tried to explain everything, but the officers just stared at me like I was insane. They said there were no reports of any strange people in the area, no one matching the man's description, and no one who'd been near the store recently. They chalked it up to exhaustion or a bad encounter with a homeless person. I didn't go back to that store after that night. The thought of being in that place alone again was too much. But every time I drive by the convenience store now, I see something in the window, a dark figure standing in the shadows, staring at me. I don't know what that man. I don't know if he was human or something else, but every time I close my eyes, I see those black eyes staring at me, and I hear that whisper, "Run," and I know I won't be able to escape next time. It was my first night working the late shift at the old gas station on the outskirts of town. The station had been around for decades, its neon sign flickering as if it were barely hanging on. The station was practically deserted after dark, and I was the only one working. Most people avoided the station at night. There had been rumors about strange happenings around here for as long as I could remember. But I needed the money, so I shrugged it off. The night started off just like any other. The quiet was almost comforting as I sat behind the counter, half reading a magazine and half watching the dark road outside. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights above and the occasional rustle of the wind against the station's sign were the only sounds. But as midnight approached, I started to notice small things at first. The air felt colder, heavier. The sound of the wind outside seemed to grow louder, like a storm was approaching, but the sky was clear. Around 2 a.m., I heard the bell above the door jingle. I looked up to see a man walk into the station. He was tall, dressed in a worn-out leather jacket and jeans. His face was obscured by the hood of his jacket, and his movements were slow and deliberate, as if each step was a struggle. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound as polite as possible. He didn't respond right away. He just stood there, looking around the station. The silence between us was thick, oppressive, like something was hanging in the air. Then, after a long pause, he walked slowly up to the counter. "I just need to use the bathroom," he said in a voice so low that I barely heard him. It was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. I nodded, pointing to the back of the station. "It's through that door, just down the hall." He didn't thank me or acknowledge my work. Instead, he turned and shuffled toward the restroom, dragging his feet as if he could barely lift them. The sound of his footsteps was unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent station. A few minutes passed, and the sense of unease in the air grew heavier. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the exhaustion setting in. But then I heard something. It was faint at first, but it became clearer with every passing second. A soft, rhythmic thudding noise, like something tapping against the walls. I leaned forward, straining to listen. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. Silence. I glanced at the clock. It had been almost 15 minutes since the man went into the bathroom. I stood up, feeling a surge of anxiety wash over me. Something didn't feel right. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay in there?" No answer. I hesitated for a moment, then walked toward the restroom, pushing open the door cautiously. The small, dimly lit hallway was empty. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, and I could hear something coming from inside. Soft, wet sounds like something dripping on the floor. I pushed the door open all the way, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The man was standing in the middle of the bathroom, his back to me. His hands were pressed against the sink, as if he were holding himself up. His head was lowered and his shoulders were shaking, but there was no sound, no movement, just the steady dripping from the faucet. I called out again, more urgently now. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He didn't respond, but the shaking grew more violent, more erratic. I stepped forward, reaching out to tap him on the shoulder. Before I could touch him, he jerked his head up, and I froze. His eyes were wide open, bloodshot, and unblinking. His pupils were dilated, completely black, as if the whites of his eyes had disappeared. His mouth twisted into a grotesque, inhuman grin that stretched far too wide, showing teeth that were far too sharp. I stumbled backward, horrified, as he turned around slowly, the unnatural grin never leaving his face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard that tapping noise again, now louder than ever, coming from all around the bathroom. It sounded like nails scraping against the walls. I felt the coldness seep into my bones, and in that moment, I knew I had to get out. But the man didn't move. He just stood there, his grin growing wider and wider, until his face seemed to stretch unnaturally, the skin on his cheeks pulling tight. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back until I reached the front of the station, gasping for air. The man was gone. I stood there for him, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing to process what had just happened. But then I heard something, the sound of dragging feet. The bell above the door jingled again, and I turned to see the man standing in the doorway, still smiling that horrible, wide grin. "You shouldn't have done that," he rasped. Before I could react, the lights above me flickered and went out, plunging the station into darkness. The sound of his footsteps grew louder as he shuffled toward me, the scraping of his feet against the floor, the only sound in the dead silence. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The door swung open again, and when I looked up, the man was gone. The station was empty. I never went back to that gas station again. I quit the next morning, but I don't think I'll ever forget that night. The memory of his eyes, those black, empty pits, haunts me every time I close my eyes. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can still hear the dragging sound of his feet, getting closer and closer. The town I grew up in was small, so small that it barely made a mark on the map. Everyone knew everyone, and rumors spread faster than the wind. But there was one place in our town that nobody really talked about, the old gas station on the outskirts, just past the... I'd heard the stories when I was a kid, but they were just stories, or so I thought. I took the job at the station one summer, desperate for some cash, after I graduated high school. The gas station had been closed for a while, but recently, a new owner had taken over. He was a strange guy, always wearing a faded red cap and an oversized jacket no matter the weather. His name was Carl, and he was the only other person there during the late shift. He mostly kept to himself, but there was something about him that always made me feel uneasy. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid, and I got to work. The first few nights were uneventful. The station had an eerie atmosphere. The lights flickered at times, and the air was thick with the scent of gasoline and dust. But nothing out of the ordinary happened, until one night. It was just past midnight, and I was working the counter when I heard a faint tapping on the window. I looked up, and there, standing in the darkness outside, was a man. His face was pale, almost ghostly white, and his clothes were ragged, as if they'd been weathered by years of wear. He wasn't asking for anything, wasn't even looking at me. Instead, he was staring out into the night, a vacant, almost hypnotized expression on it. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He just kept staring out into the distance, the tapping sound continuing, now louder and more insistent. The noise was coming from his fingers, tapping rhythmically against the glass. I took a step back, my heart pounding. Something felt wrong. I glanced around, but the station was still and quiet. Carl was in the back, probably asleep or too busy to notice. "Hey!" I shouted again, but the man didn't move. The tapping stopped, and for a brief moment, I thought he was going to leave. But then, without any warning, he pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging up the glass. His eyes were wide open, but they were empty. No pupils, no whites, just dark, hollow voids staring right at me. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. I tried to call Carl, but no words came out. My legs felt like they were frozen in place. The man smiled, a twisted grin stretching across his face. And then, with one final tap on the window, he disappeared into the night. I don't know how long I stood there, too terrified to move. The clock ticked, seconds dragging on like hours. When I finally gathered enough courage to look outside, there was nothing. No sign of the man, just the empty stretch of road and the dark woods beyond. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Carl didn't seem bothered when I told him about what happened, like it was just another bizarre incident in this strange town. He said he'd seen worse. But the next night I saw the man again. This time, he was in the parking lot, standing still under the flickering street lamp. His face was turned toward the gas pumps, but his eyes, those hollow black eyes, were still staring straight at me. I could feel them burning into me, even though he wasn't looking directly at me. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just some weird person. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was waiting for something, waiting for me. That night, as the clock struck 2 a.m., the man moved closer. This time, he wasn't standing outside anymore. He was inside the station, his figure slowly emerging from the shadows, his footsteps soft but deliberate. I could hear him dragging his feet across the floor. The noise made my skin crawl. Who are you? I asked, barely able to speak. The man didn't answer. He only moved closer, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. As he reached the counter, he leaned forward, placing his hands on the glass, his face inches from mine. The smell of something rotten filled the air, and I felt bile rise in my throat. His lips twitched in a sickening grin, and he whispered one word, barely audible, but it felt like it had been spoken directly into my soul. Run! And with that, he was gone, vanishing into thin air like a wisp of smoke. I didn't wait to return again. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and even then I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still following me, watching. I went home that night, shaking with fear. But the man didn't appear again for a while. The next few days were quiet, too quiet, and then, one evening, Carl handed me a note, a strange look on his face. "You might want to read this," he said, his voice low and serious. I opened the folded paper, my hands trembling as I read the words scrawled in a jagged, almost desperate handwriting. "You shouldn't have looked. He's coming for you." I don't know how long I stayed at that gas station after that, but I know I couldn't stay much longer. Every night after that, the tapping on the windows would start again. The hollow eyes would stare at me from the darkness. And every night the man would be a little closer. I never found out who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. You don't mess with what's hidden in the shadows, especially not in this town. I quit the job and left town as quickly as I could. But sometimes, when I'm driving through a lonely stretch of road at night, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I had always been the type of person who didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. I like to think of myself as practical, grounded, and logical. But that all changed one fateful night when I took the night shift at the old diner on the edge of town. The diner wasn't the most popular place, but it had its regulars, truckers passing through, the occasional night owl, and some people who worked late shifts at nearby factories. It wasn't fancy by any means. The walls were decorated with faded photos of the town's history, and the booths were old but comfortable. The only thing that stood out, aside from the greasy food, was the odd reputation it had. People whispered about strange occurrences, but no one could ever quite explain what happened. When I first started working there, I brushed off the rumors as silly stories. I didn't believe in anything that couldn't be explained by logic or science. But that night, alone in the diner with the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of silverware, something shifted. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual. The sound seemed to grow in intensity until it felt like it was vibrating in the air. I paused, staring at the clock as the hands moved forward, each second feeling like it dragged on longer than it should. I was cleaning the counter when I heard the door open. The jingle of the bell was soft, almost too soft, like it was being muffled. "Hello?" I called out, glancing toward the door, but no one was there. The bell stopped ringing immediately, and the door was wide open, but no footsteps followed. I shook my head, thinking I had imagined it. The diner was always quiet at this hour, and my tired mind was probably playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again. The soft sound of footsteps shuffling behind me, slow and deliberate. I froze. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. No one was there. Just the empty diner, with the flickering lights casting long shadows across the floor. My breath came in shallow bursts, and for a moment I convinced myself it was just the wind or the old creaky building settling. I went back to cleaning the counter, trying to push the feeling of unease aside. But that's when I saw it. In the reflection of the diner's window, I saw the figure of a man standing in one of the booths. I didn't recognize him. His face was hidden in shadow, and he was staring directly at me. I could feel his eyes on me even though I hadn't looked directly at him. His presence was suffocating, like he was drawing the very air out of the room. I walked over cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I reached the booth, but it was empty. The seat was still warm, and the remnants of a cup of coffee sat on the table, untouched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Someone had been here just moments ago. A sudden cold breeze swept through the diner. Despite the lack of any open windows or doors, it felt like a chill from the grave, the kind of cold that seeped deep into your bones. The temperature dropped so quickly that I could see my breath in the air. I looked up at the clock, my heart racing. The hands had stopped. It was exactly 3:15 a.m. That's when I heard the whisper, faint at first, like the rustling of old pages. But then it grew louder, clearer. The voices were unintelligible at first, a jumble of sounds that didn't make sense. But as the whispers grew, one word became painfully clear: leave. I looked around, my skin crawling. The diner felt different now, as though the air was thick with something I couldn't see. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath my feet felt unsteady, as if the ground itself was shifting. Then I saw him again. In the reflection of the greasy window, the man was sitting at the counter now, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. His face was pale, almost gray, with deep dark lines running from his eyes down to his chin. His hands were trembling slightly, and his clothes looked ragged, as if they had been worn for. I spun around, but the booth was empty. The man was gone. Panic gripped my chest. I ran to the back of the diner, wanting to get as far away from the counter as possible. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the phone and dialed the number for the owner. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. I looked out into the dining area, expecting to see the man standing there again, but the diner was empty. Suddenly, the door swung open again, the bell jingling louder than before. A gust of wind blew in, stronger this time, making the papers on the counter flutter. But this time, I saw something else. The man was standing in the doorway, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. His eyes were dark pits, devoid of any light. His mouth stretched wider than it should have, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. And then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, he spoke the words that I would never forget. "You should have left when you had the chance," I screamed, stumbling backward as he took a step forward. The lights flickered again, and the temperature plummeted. Without thinking, I ran toward the door, not caring if I was making a scene. But as I reached the threshold, I felt something grab my arm, cold and clammy like a dead hand. I twisted, trying to pull away, but it tightened, pulling me back. The whispers grew louder, frantic, urging me to leave, to run, to escape. I wrenched myself free and ran out into the night, my heart racing. I never returned to the diner after that night. The next day, I heard that the diner had closed down again. It wasn't until later that I learned the truth. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The man in the diner had died years ago, long before I ever started working there. His restless spirit had haunted the diner, and I had become the next person to experience his wrath. The town tried to forget, but every time I pass that diner, I can feel the chill of the dead man's presence, and I can hear the whisper, growing fainter with each passing day, but still lingering in the air. Leave. I never believed in the supernatural. Growing up, I had always been skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by science. But that belief was shattered the night I worked my first shift at the old gas station on the outskirts of town. It was a small, lonely place, with nothing but miles of dark roads stretching out in every direction. The station had been around for decades, and like most places that were left to decay with time, it had an unsettling aura. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its glow barely visible in the thick darkness of the surrounding woods. But the job was easy enough. Just pump gas, clean up a bit, and wait for the occasional car to roll in. And that night, the job seemed like it would be no different than any other. I arrived at 11 p.m. for my shift, the air already thick with the quiet of the night. My coworker, Carl, had warned me about the station's history, the strange sounds, the sudden drops in temperature, and the inexplicable events that seemed to happen every now and then. But I'd shrugged it off as superstition. After all, Carl was an older guy, prone to rambling about things he didn't fully understand. I spent the first couple of hours cleaning up, setting the cash register, and scanning the road for cars. But as midnight struck, things started to take a strange turn. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, with an eerie moan that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep within the forest. It wasn't unusual for the wind to pick up at night, but this felt different. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold, creeping sensation in my chest. Then I heard it, a soft tapping on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when I looked up, I saw a figure standing outside, a man. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was rigid and still, as if he were waiting for something. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice coming out shaky despite my efforts to sound confident. There was no answer, just the tapping. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The man didn't move, didn't speak. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I glanced around, looking for Carl. But he wasn't in the back. I was alone. Finally, I mustered the courage to step toward the door. The tapping stopped as soon as I reached it. I opened the door slowly, half expecting to see nothing. But the man was still there, standing just beyond the porch light, his back to me. "Can I help you?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. The man didn't turn around. Instead, he raised his hand, pointing toward the woods behind the station. Confused, I followed his gesture with my eyes. There was nothing there, just the dense forest and the thick darkness beyond. When I looked back, the man was gone. In his place, there was only a lingering chill in the air, like something had been pulled from the depths of the earth itself. I stepped outside, looking around the station, but there was no sign of the man anywhere. The tapping had stopped, and the only sound now was the whisper of the wind through the trees. I felt a strange unease crawl over me, but I forced myself to continue with my shift. Carl returned a little after, his usual gruff demeanor masking the exhaustion in his eyes. When I told him about the man, he simply shook his head. "That's just him," Carl muttered. "He comes around some. Don't let him scare you." "Who is he?" I asked, baffled. Carl didn't answer. He looked uneasy, like he didn't want to talk about it. Finally, he said, "He's just someone who's been wandering these woods for years. He shows up every now and then, but he's harmless. Just ignore him. He won't hurt you." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't press him further. The rest of the night went on without incident, and I tried to shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. But as the night wore on, things only became stranger. At 3 a.m., just as I was preparing to leave, I heard the tapping. It was louder this coming from the side of the station. I turned toward the window, and that's when I saw it. The man was standing there again, staring at me through the glass. His face was still hidden in shadow, but this time I could see something more, something unsettling. His hands were twisted, fingers elongated, almost unnatural. He didn't seem human, not in the way I understood. His skin was pale, sickly, as if he had been exposed to something no one should ever see. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The man began to tap again, his fingers scraping against the glass with a bone-chilling sound. But this time, it wasn't just a tapping. It was a scratching, desperate and frantic, as if something was trying to get inside. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the station into darkness. My breath hitched, panic rising in my chest. I scrambled to find my flashlight, but it was useless. The beam barely reached the edge of the counter. And then, I heard it. A voice, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. "Help me!" The voice was low, raspy, and full of pain. It came from behind the counter, from the storage room, where Carl had gone earlier. I rushed to the door, my flashlight shaking in my hands. But before I could open it, I heard the voice again. "Leave!" The words were clearer now, more urgent, filled with a terror that I couldn't ignore. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the door, flinging it open, and didn't stop until I reached my car. My heart pounded in my ears, my mind racing. As I sped away from the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing in the road behind me, but there was nothing. The next day, Carl was gone. No one knew what happened to him, but the station was closed indefinitely. I never found out the full story, but I didn't need to. I had learned the hard way that some things aren't meant to be. I haven't driven past that station since. Every time I go near the woods, I feel a shiver run down my spine, and I can hear the faint tapping in the distance, a reminder that some things are better left unseen. I had been working the night shift at the 24-hour convenience store for just over a week when I first noticed something strange. It started off small, a flicker in the corner of my eye, an odd sound here or there. But by the time I fully realized what was happening, it was too late to turn back. The store was a quiet place, tucked in the corner of a small, mostly forgotten neighborhood. The neon lights buzzed in the window, casting an eerie glow over the aisles of snacks, drinks, and cigarettes. It was a typical graveyard shift, slow, uneventful, and filled with an unsettling silence that only the night could bring. On that particular night, I was alone, as usual. The clock above the counter ticked louder than normal, the minute hand barely inching forward, as if it had all the time in the world. My job was simple: stock shelves, ring up customers, and keep the place clean. But I had noticed that the longer I worked there, the more it felt like the store itself watching me. I first chalked it up to fatigue. I'd been pulling late shifts, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the nights wore on, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The first odd thing happened on a Tuesday around 2 a.m. I was organizing the chip aisle when I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind or the hum of the refrigerators, but then it came again, clearer this time, almost like someone was speaking right behind me. "Help me!" I froze, my heart pounding. I glanced around, but the aisles were empty. The store was still. The lights flickered overhead, and I laughed to myself nervously. "Get a grip," I muttered, convincing myself it was just the isolation getting to me. But as the night wore on, the whispers only grew louder. I heard them almost constantly now, soft, pleading, desperate. "Help me. Let me out." It was always the same voice, but no matter how hard I looked, I never saw anyone. I started to avoid certain parts of the store, especially the back corner near the freezer section where the air always seemed unnaturally cold. I didn't want to confront whatever was making those noises, but I couldn't escape them. One night, around 3 a.m., the voice came again, louder this time. But this time, it wasn't just words. It was a sound, a scraping like fingernails dragging against metal. I rushed to the back, my breath catching in my throat. The freezer door was wide open, though I was sure I had closed it earlier. Inside, everything was covered in a thin layer of frost, the air sharp and biting. As I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. Written in the frost on the glass was a name: Evelyn. My blood ran cold. I knew that name. Evelyn was the woman who had owned the store before me. She had disappeared nearly a year ago, without a trace. Her disappearance had been one of those unsolved mysteries that everyone talked about, but no one really investigated. There had been rumors that she'd left town, that she'd gotten into some kind of trouble, but no one knew for sure. The voice whispered again, this time It wasn't pleading. It was angry, desperate, furious. You shouldn't be here. I slammed the freezer door shut, my hands trembling. I backed away, my heart racing as I glanced around the room. The store was silent again, but I could feel something heavy in the air, like the space itself was suffocating me. It didn't take long for things to escalate. The whispers grew louder, and the strange, unexplainable events became more frequent. Sometimes the lights would flicker, and I'd see a shadow dart across the aisles. Other times the doors would open and close on their own. Items would move or vanish entirely, only to reappear hours later in places I had never put them. One night, a customer came in around 4 a.m. He was an older man, hunched over, with tired eyes and an uneasy look on his face. He stepped up to the counter, placing a pack of cigarettes on the counter without a word. I rang him up, my mind still racing from the events of the past few days. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with an intensity that made me pause. "You've seen her, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. I stared at him, confused. "Who?" "The woman. Evelyn. She's still here." I felt my heart skip a beat. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around the store nervously before leaning in closer. "She never left," he whispered. "She's trapped here, and she's trying to get out. But she can't. Not without you." My throat went dry. "What are you talking?" He backed away, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he muttered to himself. "I shouldn't have said anything." He turned quickly and left the store, leaving me standing there, shaken to my core. The rest of the night was a blur. I was on edge, jumping at every little sound, every shift of light. I couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn was still here, trapped in the store with me. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of the strange happening seemed to be tied to her. The whispers, the shadows, the cold spots, they all pointed back to her. It wasn't until the following week that I finally understood what I had to do. I was cleaning up after my shift when I heard it again, the whispering voice. This time, it was no longer just a plea for help. It was an angry scream, a cry of agony. "Let me out! Let me out! Let me go!" I rushed to the freezer, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was cracked open again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it fully, stepping inside. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could barely see through the fog of frost on the glass. But then, I saw it. A figure, faint and translucent, standing at the back of the freezer. It was Evelyn. Her face was twisted in agony, her hands pressed against the glass as if she were trying to escape. And then, I heard her voice, clear as day. "Help me!" I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get out of that store and never look back. But I knew I couldn't leave. Not until I had helped her. I took a deep breath, and I made a decision. I found the key to the storage room, where the old papers were kept. I dug through them until I found the old ledger, the one that Evelyn had kept when she ran the store. In it, I found a strange entry, a ritual, a way to release a trapped spirit. It wasn't something I understood fully, but it seemed to be the only way. With trembling hands, I followed the instructions, lighting the candles and drawing the symbols on the floor. The air grew thick with tension as I chanted the words, unsure if it was even going to work. And then, as if the store itself had been holding its breath, the freezer door slammed shut. The temperature returned to normal and the whispers stopped. I stood there exhausted and shaken, but as the first light of dawn peeked through the windows, I felt a strange sense of calm. Evelyn was gone. She had finally been freed, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every time I walk past that freezer now, I hear the faintest whisper, just at the edge of hearing, "Thank you." And even though I'm still not sure if it was her or just my imagination, I never go near the freezer at night anymore. The store is quiet now, almost too quiet, but every so often I swear I can feel her present, just behind me, watching, waiting for someone else to come along and take her place.